The wagon wheels groaned beneath the weight of everything Florence Newton had left in the world. A pitiful collection of furniture and belongings scattered on the dusty street like forgotten promises. And she stood there with her 3 children clinging to her skirts, while the banker's assistant nailed a foreclosure notice to the door of what had been her home for the last 6 years. The August sun beat down mercilessly on Parowan, Utah Territory, in this summer of 1878, and Florence could feel the stares of townsfolk burning into her back as surely as the sun scorched her shoulders through the worn fabric of her black mourning dress. She had been wearing black for 14 months now, ever since Thomas had died in that mining accident up in Silver Reef, leaving her with 3 children, a mountain of debt, and promises that turned to dust. Her eldest, Margaret, was only 8 years old, clutching her younger sister Sarah's hand with fierce determination. Little Thomas, named after his father and barely 4 years old, had his face buried in Florence's skirts, sobbing quietly. Florence wanted to cry too, wanted to fall apart right there on Main Street, but she could not afford that luxury. She was 26 years old, and she had to figure out where they would sleep tonight. "Mrs. Newton, you need to clear these belongings from the street by sundown, or they will be considered abandoned property," the banker's assistant said, not meeting her eyes. He was young, maybe 20, and clearly uncomfortable with this duty. But discomfort did not pay rent or fill empty stomachs. Florence opened her mouth to respond, though she had no idea what she would say when a voice spoke up from behind her. "I have got a wagon right here. We can load everything up." She turned to see a tall man standing beside a sturdy freight wagon pulled by 2 strong horses. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that needed cutting, wearing dusty range clothes and a hat that had seen better days. But his eyes were kind as they met hers, a warm brown that reminded her of the coffee she could no longer afford to buy. "I am sorry, but I cannot pay you," Florence said quietly, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled. "I have got nothing left." The man stepped forward, removing his hat respectfully. "Robert Fuller, madam, and I am not asking for payment. Let me help you load your things, and then you and your children can follow me. I have got a place where you can stay." Florence stared at him, trying to make sense of this offer. She had learned the hard way that nothing came free in this world, especially not kindness from strangers. "Why would you do that?" Robert looked at her children, then back at her face. "Because it is the right thing to do. Because I have got the space and the means, and you have got need." "That seems like enough reason to me." Before Florence could respond, the banker's assistant cleared his throat. "Mrs. Newton, you really do need to clear the street." Robert's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Then let us get to work." He moved to the scattered furniture, lifting a heavy chair as though it weighed nothing. Florence hesitated for only a moment longer before she began gathering their belongings as well. Margaret joined in immediately, trying to carry more than her small frame could handle. Robert noticed and gently took a crate from the girl's arms. "You help your mother with the lighter things, miss. I will handle the heavy loads." Margaret looked up at him with wide eyes, then nodded solemnly. They worked in silence for the most part, the efficiency of necessity driving them forward. Florence found herself studying Robert Fuller as they loaded the wagon. He moved with the easy strength of a man accustomed to hard labor, but there was something careful in the way he handled her few precious possessions, setting down her mother's china carefully, making sure nothing broke. Neighbors watched from windows and doorways, but no one else came to help. Florence was not surprised. She had learned in the months since Thomas died that friendship often evaporated in the face of poverty. People were afraid it might be contagious, as though bad luck could spread like influenza. Within an hour, Everything she owned was loaded into Robert's wagon. It did not fill even half the bed, a sobering reminder of how little remained of the life she and Thomas had built together. Robert secured the load with practiced hands, then turned to Florence. "My ranch is about 5 miles north of town. Can the little ones ride that far?" Florence looked at her exhausted children. Sarah was barely 6 years old, and Thomas Jr. looked ready to collapse. "They are tired, but they are strong." Robert studied them for a moment, then made a decision. "The children can ride in the wagon with the belongings. You too, if you would like, Mrs. Newton. I will walk alongside the horses." "That does not seem fair to you," Florence protested. "I walk beside horses every day, madam. It is no hardship." His tone left no room for argument. Florence lifted her children into the wagon bed, arranging them on top of a mattress so they would be comfortable. They huddled together, and she climbed up to sit beside them, her back against a dresser. Robert swung himself up onto the driver's bench, released the brake, and clicked his tongue to get the horses moving. As they rolled out of Parowan, Florence looked back once at the only home her younger children had ever known. Then she forced herself to look forward, toward whatever future awaited them at this stranger's ranch. The ride took longer than expected because Robert kept the horses at a slow, steady pace, mindful of his passengers. Florence appreciated the consideration even as anxiety gnawed at her. What was she doing, following a strange man to an unknown location with her 3 children? But what choice did she have? She had no money, no family in the territory, and nowhere else to go. The landscape around them was beautiful in its harsh way, red rock formations rising against a brilliant blue sky, sagebrush and juniper dotting the valley. In other circumstances, Florence might have enjoyed the view. Now she could only wonder what she was getting herself and her children into. Robert's ranch, when they finally reached it, was larger and more prosperous looking than Florence had dared to hope. A solid 2-story house sat at the center, built of timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. There were several outbuildings, a barn, corrals with horses, and in the distance she could see cattle grazing. Robert pulled the wagon up in front of the house and set the brake. He climbed down and came around to help Florence and the children out of the wagon bed. His hand was warm and calloused when she accepted it, steadying herself as she climbed down. "Welcome to the Fuller Ranch," he said simply. "Come inside. I will get your things settled later, but first, you all look like you could use something to eat and drink." He led them up onto the porch and through a heavy wooden door. The interior of the house was clean and well-maintained, but clearly lacked a woman's touch. The furniture was functional rather than decorative, and there were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no small touches that made a house a home. Robert guided them to a large kitchen with a massive cookstove and a solid oak table. "Sit down, please." Florence sank into a chair, and her children pressed close to her. Robert worked quickly, pumping water into glasses, slicing bread, bringing out butter and jam and cold roast beef. It was simple food, but to Florence and her children, who had been living on very little for months, it looked like a feast. "Eat as much as you want," Robert said, sitting down across from them. "There is plenty." The children looked to Florence for permission, and she nodded. They fell on the food with barely controlled desperation, and Florence had to force herself to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity even in the face of her hunger. Robert watched them with an expression Florence could not quite read. Pity, perhaps, but also something else. Anger, maybe, though not directed at them. When the children had eaten their fill and were beginning to droop with exhaustion, Robert stood. "Let me show you where you will be staying." He led them upstairs to a large bedroom with 2 beds and a window overlooking the valley. This is the biggest bedroom aside from mine. I figured the children could share one bed and you could take the other, Mrs. Newton. Or we can arrange it however works best for you." Florence looked around the room, barely able to process that this was real. "Mr. Fuller, I do not understand. You do not know us. Why are you doing this?" Robert was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the door frame. "My mother was widowed when I was 12 years old. My father died in the war, left her with 4 children and nothing but debts. We lost our home, had to split up and live with different relatives who did not really want us. It was the hardest time of my life, and I know it broke something in my mother. She died just 5 years later." He looked at Florence directly. "I have got the means to help now, and I will not turn away a woman with children who has nowhere else to go. It is as simple as that." Florence felt tears burning in her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "I will work for our keep. I can cook and clean and help with whatever you need. I will not be a charity case." "I did not figure you would be," Robert said with a slight smile. "But for tonight, just rest. We can talk about everything else tomorrow." He left them alone then, and Florence helped her children out of their dusty clothes and into one of the beds. They were asleep almost before their heads hit the pillows, exhausted by the trauma of the day. Florence sat on the edge of the other bed, still wearing her mourning dress, and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. She had lost her home. She was dependent on the charity of a stranger. Her children were sleeping in an unfamiliar house, and she had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but they were safe. They had food in their bellies and a roof over their heads. For tonight, that would have to be enough. Florence finally undressed down to her chemise and crawled under the covers. Through the window, she could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about Thomas, wondered what he would think of this situation. Would he be grateful that someone had helped his family? Angry that Florence had accepted help from another man? But Thomas was dead, and Florence had to make choices based on the living. She closed her eyes and fell into an exhausted sleep. Florence woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of her children's voices downstairs. Panic seized her immediately until she remembered where she was. She dressed quickly in another black dress, one of only 2 she owned now, and hurried downstairs. She found her children in the kitchen with Robert, who was cooking breakfast at the stove. Bacon sizzled in a pan, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Margaret was setting the table with plates, following Robert's quiet instructions. Sarah was carefully placing forks beside each plate, and little Thomas was watching everything with wide eyes. "Good morning, Mrs. Newton," Robert said when he noticed her in the doorway. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Florence admitted. "You did not have to cook breakfast. That should be my job if I am staying here." Robert flipped the bacon expertly. "This morning, you are a guest. Starting tomorrow, if you want to take over the cooking, I will not argue. I am decent at keeping myself fed, but I will not claim to be any kind of real cook." Florence moved into the kitchen, drawn by the warmth and the smells and the strange domesticity of the scene. "My children should not be bothering you." "They are not bothering me at all," Robert said firmly. He looked at Margaret with a smile. "Miss Margaret here is a fine helper. She has been telling me about the spelling bee she won at school last spring." Margaret beamed with pride, and Florence felt her heart twist. Her daughter had so few opportunities to be proud of anything lately. They all sat down to breakfast together, and Florence could not remember the last time she had seen her children so animated. They were still cautious around Robert, but his calm, steady presence seemed to put them at ease. He treated them with a respect that many adults did not show children, listening when they spoke and answering their questions seriously. After breakfast, Robert pushed back from the table. "Mrs. Newton, would you walk with me? I want to show you around the ranch, explain how things work here." Florence nodded and followed him outside, grateful that her children seemed content to explore the house. The morning was already growing warm, but a light breeze made it pleasant. Robert led her first to the barn, a large structure that housed several horses and milk cows. "I run cattle mainly," Robert explained as they walked. "I've got about 300 head spread out across the range. I also keep some horses, breed them for sale. The milk cows are just for personal use. There are chickens too, for eggs and meat." Florence listened, trying to understand the scope of the operation. "How do you manage all this by yourself?" "I've got 2 ranch hands who work for me, Miguel and his son Carlos. They live in the bunkhouse over there." He pointed to a smaller building behind the barn. "They are good men, hard workers. Miguel has been with me since I started this place 6 years ago." 6 years. Robert had built all this in just 6 years. Florence felt a reluctant admiration for the man's work ethic and capability. "The house has 4 bedrooms upstairs," Robert continued as they walked back toward the main house. "You and your children are in one. I am in another. The other 2 are empty, full of odds and ends mostly. The lower floor has the kitchen, a sitting room, and a small office where I keep my accounts. There is a root cellar for storage and a smokehouse out back. The well water is good and clean." Florence absorbed all this information, then took a breath and asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "What exactly are you expecting from me, Mr. Fuller? You said I could work for our keep, but what kind of work?" Robert stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I need someone to manage the house. Cook meals, keep things clean, tend the vegetable garden that I have been neglecting, preserve food for winter, that sort of thing. In return, you and your children get room and board and a safe place to live. If you want wages on top of that, we can discuss it, but I figured having your needs met might be more important right now than cash money." "And that is all?" Florence asked, holding his gaze. "You are not expecting anything else?" Understanding dawned in Robert's eyes and a flush crept up his neck. "No, madam. I am not that kind of man. You will have your own room with a lock on the door if that makes you feel safer. This is strictly a business arrangement. I need help running this household and you need a home." That is the extent of it. Florence felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I appreciate your directness, Mr. Fuller, and I accept your offer. I will work hard, I promise you that." "I do not doubt it," Robert said. "And please call me Robert. Mr. Fuller makes me feel old." "Then you should call me Florence," she replied. It felt strange, offering that familiarity to a man she had just met. But if they were going to be living under the same roof, formality would become awkward quickly. Over the following days, Florence settled into a rhythm at the ranch. She took over the cooking, much to everyone's relief. Robert's culinary skills were indeed limited to the basics, and Miguel and Carlos, who took their meals at the main house, were effusive in their praise of Florence's simple but well-prepared food. Florence also threw herself into cleaning the house from top to bottom, washing windows that probably had not been properly cleaned in years, scrubbing floors, organizing cupboards. She found satisfaction in the work, in making order out of chaos, in creating a home out of Robert's bachelor dwelling. Her children began to blossom in the safe environment. Margaret helped with chores and started exploring the ranch, fascinated by the animals. Sarah, who had been withdrawn and quiet for months, began to smile again. Little Thomas followed Robert around like a puppy whenever the rancher was near the house, and Robert showed remarkable patience with the boy's endless questions. Florence watched the interactions between Robert and her son with mixed feelings. Thomas needed a man in his life, someone to look up to and learn from. But Florence worried about her children getting too attached to this situation, to this place, to this man. Nothing lasted forever. She had learned that lesson painfully. 3 weeks after they arrived at the ranch, Florence was in the kitchen making bread when Robert came in looking troubled. She glanced up from her kneading, flour dusting her hands and forearms. "What is wrong?" Robert sat down at the table heavily. "I just got word from town. There is going to be a community dance next Saturday night to celebrate the harvest season." Florence went back to kneading. "That sounds nice. People will expect me to be there," Robert continued, "and they will expect you and the children to come too. There will be questions about our arrangement." Florence's hands stilled in the dough. She had not thought about how their situation might look to outsiders. A widowed woman living in a bachelor's house, even with children present, even with the respectability of a working arrangement, would fuel gossip. "What do people think?" she asked quietly. "I have not been to town since I brought you here," Robert admitted, "but I imagine tongues are wagging." "They usually do." Florence resumed kneading with more force than necessary. "I do not care what small-minded people think. I am doing honest work for honest pay. There is nothing shameful in that." "I agree completely," Robert said, "but I do care if gossip makes your life harder. If you would rather stay here next Saturday, I will make your excuses." Florence considered this. Part of her wanted to hide to avoid the stares and whispers. But another part of her, the part that had always been stubborn, rebelled against the idea of cowering. "No," she said firmly. "We will go. Let people see that we have nothing to hide." Robert nodded slowly. "If you are sure." "I am sure." The following Saturday, Florence dressed her children in their best clothes, which were not saying much. She herself had only her morning dresses, and she chose the one that was slightly less worn. She tried not to think about how shabby they must all look. Robert drove them to town in the wagon, wearing clean clothes and a newer hat. Florence sat beside him on the bench while the children rode in the back, excited about the prospect of music and dancing and other children to play with. The dance was being held in the town hall, a large wooden structure on the edge of Parowan's Main Street. Lanterns had been strung up outside, and Florence could hear fiddle music drifting through the open doors as they approached. Robert helped her down from the wagon, his hand warm and steady on hers. She could feel people watching as they walked toward the hall, her children clustered around her skirts. Robert walked beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Inside, the hall was crowded with people from town and the surrounding ranches. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and musicians played on a small raised platform at the far end. Couples were already dancing, and children raced around the perimeter of the room. Florence felt the weight of dozens of stares as they entered. Conversations stopped, then resumed in hushed whispers. She lifted her chin and met the gazes steadily, refusing to show any shame or embarrassment. "Florence, why do not you and the children get something to eat?" Robert suggested quietly. "I need to speak with a few people about some business matters." Florence nodded, understanding that he was giving her space, not wanting people to think he was hovering over her possessively. She guided her children to the food tables, where Margaret immediately began loading a plate with cookies and cake. "Just a few sweets, Margaret," Florence cautioned. "Make sure you eat some real food, too." A woman approached them, someone Florence did not recognize. She was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, with a kind face. "You must be Mrs. Newton. I am Eleanor Foster. My husband runs the mercantile in town." Florence braced herself for judgment but found none in the woman's expression. "It is nice to meet you, Mrs. Foster. Please call me Eleanor. I wanted to welcome you to Parowan properly. I know you have had a difficult time of it." Eleanor glanced at the children, who were focused on their food. "I also wanted to say that I think it is wonderful what Robert Fuller has done, giving you and your children a safe place to land. He is a good man, one of the best in this territory." Florence felt some of her defensiveness ease. "He has been very kind to us." "I hope you will not let the gossips bother you," Elinor continued quietly. "There are always a few who like to make trouble where there is none, but most folks in Parowan are decent people who understand that sometimes life is hard and we have to help each other through it." "Thank you," Florence said, meaning it. "That means more than you know," Elinor smiled. "If you ever need anything at all, you come find me at the Mercantile. I mean that." As Elinor moved away, Florence felt tears prick her eyes. She had been so braced for condemnation that kindness caught her off guard. The evening progressed, and Florence found herself relaxing despite her initial anxiety. Several other women approached her with welcoming words. A few were clearly just fishing for gossip, but Florence kept her answers brief and unrevealing. Yes, she worked for Mr. Fuller as his housekeeper. Yes, the children were adjusting well. No, she did not know how long they would be staying. She watched Robert across the room talking with a group of ranchers. He looked at ease, respected by the men around him. Several times, she saw women watching him with interest, and Florence felt an unexpected pang of something that might have been jealousy, which was ridiculous. Robert Fuller was her employer, nothing more. But then he caught her eye across the room and smiled, just a small private smile that seemed meant only for her, and Florence felt her heart do an odd little skip. She looked away quickly, focusing on her children. She could not afford to develop feelings for Robert Fuller. She was a widow, still in mourning, dependent on his charity. Any romantic entanglement would be inappropriate and dangerous to the stability she was trying to build for her children. The fiddle struck up a lively tune and couples flooded onto the dance floor. Florence watched wistfully. She had always loved dancing and Thomas had been a good dancer. But those days were behind her now. "Would you like to dance?" She turned to find Robert standing beside her. He must have crossed the room while she was lost in thought. "I should not," Florence said automatically. "I am in mourning." "You have been in mourning for over a year," Robert said gently. "At some point you have to let yourself live again, Florence. It is just a dance, nothing scandalous." Florence hesitated, torn between propriety and the desire to feel normal, to feel young, to feel something besides worry and grief. Robert held out his hand. "One dance. If you hate it, we will stop." Florence looked at his outstretched hand, calloused from hard work, steady and strong. She thought about all the ways this man had helped her, asking nothing in return. She thought about how long it had been since she had done anything just for the simple joy of it. She placed her hand in his. "One dance." Robert's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He led her onto the dance floor and pulled her into the proper position for a reel. His hand was warm on her waist, and Florence felt suddenly breathless in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. The music started, and they began to move. Robert was a good dancer, confident and sure-footed, guiding her through the steps with ease. Florence found herself laughing as they spun and stepped, the music carrying her away from her worries for just a little while. She caught glimpses of her children watching from the sidelines, Margaret smiling widely, and that made Florence smile too. When was the last time her daughter had seen her mother laugh? The dance ended too soon, and Florence found herself slightly out of breath, her cheeks flushed. Robert was looking at her with an expression she could not quite read, something warm and tender in his eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "The pleasure was mine," Robert replied, and Florence believed him. They rejoined her children, and the rest of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. When it was time to leave, Florence bundled her sleepy children into the wagon and Robert drove them home through the darkness. The air was cool, the sky filled with stars, and Florence felt something she had not felt in a long time: contentment. Back at the ranch, Robert carried sleeping Thomas upstairs while Florence guided the girls. After the children were tucked into bed, Florence went back downstairs and found Robert in the kitchen, drinking a glass of water. "Thank you for tonight," Florence said from the doorway. "The children had a wonderful time." "What about you?" Robert asked, turning to face her. "Did you have a wonderful time?" Florence considered the question. "I did, more than I expected to." "Good." Robert set down his glass. "You deserve to have wonderful times, Florence, you and your children. You deserve to be happy." "So do you," Florence said, surprising herself with her boldness. Robert's expression turned somber. "I have been happy. This ranch, building something of my own, it has been good, but sometimes it gets lonely. A house is not the same as a home." Florence understood what he meant. She had been so focused on survival that she had forgotten about living. But these past few weeks at the ranch, cooking in a real kitchen, watching her children play safely, talking with Robert over dinner, she had started to feel alive again. "I should get to bed," Florence said, suddenly aware of the intimacy of standing in the kitchen with Robert in the quiet darkness. "Good night." "Good night, Florence," Robert said softly. Florence went upstairs, but sleep was slow to come. She kept thinking about the warmth of Robert's hand on her waist, the way he had looked at her on the dance floor, the sound of his laugh when she had stumbled over a dance step. She was starting to have feelings for Robert Fuller. Real feelings, not just gratitude or dependence. She was starting to care about him as a man, not just as the person who had saved her family. And that terrified her. Over the next several weeks, Florence tried to maintain careful distance from Robert. She focused on her work, on her children, on anything except the growing attraction she felt. But living in the same house made avoidance difficult. Robert seemed to sense her withdrawal and gave her space, but Florence caught him watching her sometimes with that same tender expression he had worn at the dance. She wondered what he was thinking, if he felt any of what she was feeling. Autumn came to the valley, painting the landscape in golds and reds. Florence spent long days preserving food for the winter, canning vegetables from the garden, smoking meat, making sure they would have plenty to eat when the snow came. Robert and his ranch hands worked from dawn to dusk preparing the cattle for winter, fixing fences, stockpiling hay. One evening in late October, Florence was alone in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. The children were in bed, and Robert was supposedly working on his accounts in the office, but he came into the kitchen instead. "Florence, can we talk?" She dried her hands on her apron, anxiety suddenly coiling in her stomach. "Of course. What is it?" Robert leaned against the door frame, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I have been thinking. Winter is coming and it can be brutal up here. Once the heavy snows start, we might be snowed in for weeks at a time." "I understand," Florence said, not sure where this was going. "What I am trying to say is that if you wanted to move back to town before winter sets in, I would understand. I could help you find a place, help you get set up. You have been working hard and I have got some money saved. I could help you and the children get a fresh start." Florence stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You want us to leave?" "No," Robert said quickly, pushing off from the door frame. "That is not what I meant at all. I just wanted you to know that you have options. I do not want you to feel trapped here because winter is coming and you have nowhere else to go." "Do you want us to leave?" Florence asked again, her voice steadier than she felt. Robert ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated with himself. "I want you to stay. God help me, I want you to stay. But I do not want you to stay out of obligation or because you feel you have no choice." Florence set down the dish towel she had been holding. "Why do you want us to stay, Robert?" He met her eyes directly. "Because I have gotten used to having you here. All of you. Because this house feels like a home now in a way it never did before. Because I look forward to meals around the table and hearing the children play and talking with you at the end of the day. Because you have become important to me, Florence. More important than is probably appropriate. Florence's heart was pounding. Robert, I am still wearing mourning black. I am still Thomas's widow. It has only been 15 months. I know, Robert said quietly. And I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I just needed you to know where I stand. I care about you, Florence, not just as my housekeeper, but as a woman. As someone I admire and respect and yes, have feelings for. You do not have to do anything with that information. I just needed to be honest with you. Florence felt tears burning in her eyes. I care about you too. I have been trying not to, telling myself it is too soon, that it is inappropriate, that I am just grateful for everything you have done for us. But I think it is more than gratitude. Robert took a step toward her, then stopped himself. Where does that leave us? I do not know, Florence admitted. Thomas was a good man. He did not deserve to die so young to leave us struggling. I feel like I owe him something, like moving on is a betrayal somehow. Or maybe the best way to honor him is to live, Robert suggested gently. To give his children a stable home and a chance at happiness. To let yourself have a second chance at life and love. Florence wiped at her eyes. It is too soon. People would talk. People already talk, Robert pointed out. And I do not care what they think. But if you need more time, I will wait. I will wait as long as you need, Florence. You are worth waiting for. The simple declaration undid something in Florence's chest. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of Robert, looking up into his kind, patient face. You are a good man, Robert Fuller. Better than I deserve. You deserve the world, Robert said softly. He raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You deserve to be happy. Florence leaned into his touch for just a moment, letting herself feel the comfort and connection she had been denying for weeks. Then she stepped back, needing distance to think clearly. I need time, she said. I am not saying no. I am just saying I need time to figure out what I am feeling, what is right for me and for my children. Take all the time you need, Robert said. I am not going anywhere. Winter came early and hard that year. By mid-November, snow blanketed the valley, and the temperature dropped until the windows frosted over every night. Florence had never experienced a winter like this, and she was grateful for Robert's preparations. The house was well stocked with food and firewood, and the animals were safely sheltered in the barn. Being snowed in forced a different kind of intimacy. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but the daily chores and the long evenings together. Robert taught Margaret how to play chess, using a set his father had carved years ago. He showed Thomas Jr. how to whittle simple shapes from scraps of wood. He sat with Sarah and listened to her read from the few books they owned, praising her progress. Florence watched these interactions and felt her heart opening despite her best efforts to guard it. Robert was so good with her children, patient and kind and genuinely interested in them. They were blossoming under his attention, especially Thomas, who desperately needed a male figure in his life. The evenings became Florence's favorite time. After the children were in bed, she and Robert would sit in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, and talk. Really talk in a way Florence had never talked with anyone, not even her late husband. Robert told her about his childhood, about losing his father and the painful years that followed, about working hard jobs from a young age to save money, about his dream of owning land and building something that could not be taken away. Florence told him about her life too, about growing up poor in Missouri, about marrying Thomas when she was 18, about the hope they had felt when they came west looking for a better life. about the joy of having children and the terror of Thomas's death, and the slow slide into poverty that followed. One evening in December, a blizzard howled outside, rattling the windows and piling snow against the house. Florence had made a hearty stew for dinner, and after the children were asleep, she and Robert sat at the kitchen table with cups of hot coffee. "You ever regret it?" Robert asked suddenly. "Coming west, I mean, leaving Missouri," Florence considered the question. "Sometimes. Especially after Thomas died. I thought about trying to go back, but there was nothing there for me anymore. My parents died when I was young, and I have got no siblings. Thomas was all the family I had, and his family never approved of me." "Why not?" Florence smiled bitterly. "I was not good enough for their son. My parents were sharecroppers, practically nothing. Thomas's family had a small farm, but to them it might as well have been a plantation. They thought he married beneath him." "Then they were fools," Robert said firmly. "You are smart and strong and beautiful. Any man would be lucky to have you." Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You should not say things like that." "Why not? It is true." She looked at him across the table, at his honest, open face, and felt something inside her shift. She had been holding on so tightly to her grief, to her identity as Thomas's widow, to the idea that moving on would be a betrayal. But maybe Robert was right. Maybe the best way to honor Thomas was to live fully, to give their children a good life, to let herself be happy again. "Robert," she said softly, "I think I am ready." He looked confused. "Ready for what?" "Ready to stop being afraid. Ready to stop hiding behind my widow's weeds. Ready to admit that I have feelings for you and that I want to see where those feelings might lead." Robert went very still. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel rushed or pressured." "I am sure," Florence said, and she was. It had been 16 months since Thomas died. She would always love him, always carry him in her heart, but she was still alive. She still had a future. And she wanted that future to include Robert Fuller. Robert reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was warm and strong and steady. "I will court you properly. I will do this right." Florence laughed, a little shakily. "We are living in the same house." "I am not sure how proper we can be." "I will find a way," Robert said seriously. "You deserve to be courted, Florence. You deserve romance and respect and someone who shows you every day how much you mean to them." Over the following weeks, Robert proceeded to do exactly that. He was unfailingly respectful, never pushing for more than Florence was ready to give. But he also found small ways to show his affection. He brought her wildflowers he found during winter rides, their bright colors cheerful against the snow. He sat with her in the evenings and read aloud while she mended clothes, their chairs drawn close together by the fire. He complimented her cooking, her work, her way with the children. He also, to Florence's delight and embarrassment, began leaving her small notes. She would find them tucked in the kitchen, written in his careful handwriting. Simple things. "Thank you for the wonderful breakfast. You make every day brighter." Or "You look beautiful in the morning light." Or simply "Thinking of you." The children noticed the change between Florence and Robert and seemed delighted by it. Margaret, old enough to understand what was happening, started referring to Robert as almost a father figure. Sarah and Thomas followed their older sister's lead. One evening in January, after a day of bright sunshine that had melted some of the snow, Robert asked Florence to take a walk with him. She bundled up in her warmest shawl, and they walked out into the crystalline evening, their breath frosting in the cold air. "I wanted to talk to you away from the house," Robert said as they walked slowly around the ranch yard. "About the future." Florence's heart began to beat faster. "What about it?" Robert stopped walking and turned to face her. "I love you, Florence. I think I have loved you since that first day in town when I saw you standing there with your children, so fierce and brave even though your world had fallen apart. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you love your children. I love how you have turned my house into a home. I love everything about you." Florence felt tears freezing on her cheeks. "I love you too, Robert. I did not think I could feel this way again, but I do." Robert pulled off his gloves and took her hands in his. "Then marry me, Florence. Make this permanent. Let me be a husband to you and a father to your children. Let me give you the kind of life you deserve." Florence looked up at him, at this good, solid, wonderful man who had appeared in her life when she needed him most. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Robert pulled her into his arms, and Florence felt the warmth and strength of him, felt safe in a way she had not felt in so long. He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and Florence kissed him back, letting herself feel all the love and hope and possibility that came with this new beginning. They told the children the next morning over breakfast. Margaret squealed with delight and hugged both of them. Sarah clapped her hands and asked if she could be in the wedding. Little Thomas looked at Robert seriously and said, "Does this mean you will really be my papa?" Robert knelt down and looked the boy in the eye and said, "If you want me to be, then yes, I will be your papa." Thomas threw his arms around Robert's neck, and Florence had to turn away to hide her tears. They decided to wait until spring for the wedding, wanting good weather for the ceremony and time to prepare properly. Florence wanted to make a dress that was not black, wanted to have something beautiful to wear when she married Robert. She also needed time to adjust to the idea that she was really doing this, really moving forward with her life. The winter months passed in a glow of happiness. Robert taught Thomas how to feed the horses and do simple chores. He helped Margaret with her studies, finding old school books in town and bringing them home for her. He played endless games with Sarah, his patience seemingly limitless. With Florence, Robert was tender and affectionate, always respectful of the boundaries she set, but making sure she knew how much he loved her. They talked about their future, about combining their families, about the life they would build together. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared, they went to town together to speak with the minister. Reverend Potter was an elderly man with kind eyes who had baptized Florence's children and presided over Thomas's funeral. He greeted them warmly in his small church. "Mrs. Newton, Mr. Fuller, what can I do for you?" "We would like you to marry us, Reverend," Robert said, his hand resting gently on Florence's back. "As soon as possible." Reverend Potter smiled. "I think that is wonderful. You have both faced hardship and loss, and you deserve happiness." "When were you thinking?" "Early April," Florence suggested. "When the weather is better, but before Robert gets too busy with the spring cattle work." "April 5th is a Saturday," the Reverend said, consulting a calendar. "Would that work?" Florence looked at Robert, who nodded. "That would be perfect." They spent the next few weeks preparing. Eleanor Foster, who had become a friend to Florence, helped her make a dress from fabric Robert bought at the mercantile. It was a simple design in a soft blue color, the first non-black dress Florence had worn in nearly 18 months. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked young again, hopeful, alive. Margaret, Sarah, and Thomas also got new clothes for the wedding. Robert spared no expense, wanting the children to feel special on this day. He also bought a new suit for himself, looking handsome and nervous when he tried it on. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful. Spring had truly arrived, with wildflowers blooming across the valley and birds singing in the trees. The ceremony was held in the small church in Parowan, with Miguel and Carlos and Eleanor Foster, and a handful of other friends in attendance. Florence stood at the back of the church with her 3 children clustered around her, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Margaret held her hand tightly, and Sarah and Thomas stood on her other side. They all looked beautiful in their new clothes, and Florence felt a wave of love so intense it nearly knocked her over. "Are you happy, Mama?" Margaret whispered. "So happy, sweetheart," Florence whispered back. Then the music started, and it was time. Florence walked down the aisle with her children, and Robert stood at the front watching them with such love in his eyes that Florence's vision blurred with tears. They reached the front of the church, and Reverend Potter smiled at them all. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Robert Fuller and Florence Newton in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple and beautiful. Robert and Florence exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When Robert slid a simple gold band onto Florence's finger, she felt the weight of it like a promise, like a new beginning. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Potter said warmly. "Robert, you may kiss your bride." Robert cupped Florence's face gently in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that Florence felt her heart might burst. The small congregation applauded, and her children cheered, and Florence knew that this was right. This was where she was supposed to be with this man, building this life. After the ceremony, everyone returned to the ranch for a celebration dinner. Florence had prepared food in advance, and Alina had brought desserts. They ate and talked and laughed, and Florence thought she had never been so happy. As the sun set and their guests prepared to leave, Robert pulled Florence aside. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Fuller?" "Mrs. Fuller," Florence repeated, testing out the name. "I think I like the sound of that." "Good," Robert said, pulling her close, "because you are stuck with it now." After everyone had gone and the children were in bed, Robert and Florence finally had a moment alone. They stood together on the porch, looking out at the valley bathed in moonlight. "Thank you," Florence said softly. "For what?" "For saving me. For saving my children. For loving us even when we had nothing to offer you." Robert turned to face her. "You had everything to offer, Florence. You gave me a family. You gave me a home. You gave me a reason to come in from the fields at the end of the day. You gave me purpose and joy and love. I should be thanking you." Florence kissed him then, deep and long, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Robert took her hand. "Come with me, wife," he said with a smile that made her heart race. He led her upstairs to his bedroom, which would now be their bedroom, and closed the door behind them. Florence was nervous, even though she had been married before, because this was different. This was Robert, and she loved him in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. Robert seemed to sense her nervousness because he took his time, undressing her slowly, kissing her gently, murmuring words of love and reassurance. He made her feel beautiful and cherished and desired, and when they finally came together, it felt like coming home. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Florence's head resting on Robert's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I would have this again," Florence whispered. "A husband, love, a future." Robert's arms tightened around her. "You have it all now, darling. And I promise I will spend every day making sure you know how loved you are." Florence believed him. The years that followed were good ones. Robert's ranch prospered, and with Florence managing the household efficiently, they were able to save money and expand the operation. Margaret, Sarah, and Thomas thrived, growing up strong and happy. Robert adopted them legally, giving them his name and making them truly his children in every way that mattered. 2 years after they married, Florence gave birth to a son they named Robert Jr., but who everyone called Bobby. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, and Robert Sr. was besotted with the baby. Florence watched her husband with their infant son and felt her heart swell with love. "I never imagined I could be this happy," she told Robert one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, Bobby sleeping in her arms and the other children playing in the yard. "Neither did I," Robert admitted. "But I think sometimes the best things in life are the ones we did not plan for. You and the children, all of this, it is more than I ever dreamed of." 3 years later, they had another child, a daughter they named Rose. She was a tiny, delicate baby who grew into a spirited little girl with her mother's determination and her father's kindness. The house that had once seemed too big for one man was now filled with noise and laughter and life. Florence made sure all the children, hers by Thomas and hers by Robert, were treated equally. There was no division, no yours and mine, only ours. Robert was father to all of them, and he loved each one fiercely. Margaret grew into a beautiful, intelligent young woman. When she was 19, she married a schoolteacher from Cedar City, and the wedding was held at the ranch with half the county in attendance. Florence cried as she watched her eldest daughter dance with her new husband, remembering the frightened 8-year-old who had stood in the street that terrible day in Parowan. Sarah became a skilled seamstress and opened a small shop in town, living above the store but coming home for Sunday dinners. Thomas followed his father into ranching, working alongside Robert and eventually taking over more and more of the operation as Robert grew older. Bobby and Rose grew up knowing nothing but love and security, never experiencing the fear and poverty that had marked their older siblings' early years. As the years passed, Florence sometimes thought about that day in Parowan when she had stood in the street with everything she owned scattered around her, not knowing where her next meal would come from or where her children would sleep. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to someone else. Robert seemed to know when she was thinking about the past. He would find her wherever she was, wrap his arms around her from behind and kiss the top of her head. "No regrets?" he would ask. "None," Florence would always answer. "Not a single one." On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party at the ranch. All of them were there, even Margaret with her 3 children and Sarah with her husband and new baby. The house was packed with family and friends, filled with food and laughter and love. That night, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, Florence and Robert sat together on the porch swing Robert had built for her 10th anniversary. The night was clear and warm, the stars brilliant overhead. "20 years," Florence said softly. "It seems impossible." "Best 20 years of my life," Robert said, taking her hand. His hair was gray now and lines marked his face, but his eyes were the same warm brown that had looked at her with such kindness that first day. "Mine too," Florence agreed. She was 46 now, no longer young, but she felt young when she was with Robert. He made her feel beautiful and cherished even as her hair turned silver and her body softened with age. "You remember that day in town?" Robert asked. "When I first saw you?" "Every detail," Florence said. "I remember thinking you must want something from me, that no one was that kind for no reason." "I wanted you," Robert said simply. "Maybe I did not know it right away, but some part of me knew you were going to change my life." "We changed each other's lives," Florence corrected. "You saved me, but I think maybe I saved you too, from loneliness, from a life half-lived." Robert pulled her closer. "We saved each other, and we built something beautiful. Look at our family, Florence. 5 children, 3 grandchildren so far, a ranch that is thriving. We did that together." Florence leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling completely content. "I used to be so scared of the future. After Thomas died, I could not see past the next day, the next hour. I never imagined I could have this much happiness." "You deserve every bit of it," Robert said firmly. "You are the strongest, bravest, most incredible woman I have ever known. I thank God every day that I was in town that afternoon, that I saw you standing there and had the courage to offer help. I thank God I was brave enough to accept it, Florence said. I was so scared, Robert. Scared of trusting a stranger, scared of what people would think, scared of feeling anything for anyone after losing Thomas. But you were so patient, so kind. You gave me time to heal, time to find myself again. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, rocking gently on the swing, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled and horses nickered softly in the barn. You think Thomas would approve? Florence asked suddenly. It was a question she had not voiced in years, but sometimes she still wondered. Robert thought about it carefully. I think Thomas would be grateful that his children were raised by a man who loved them. I think he would be glad you found happiness again instead of spending your life grieving. I think he would want you to live fully, not just survive. I think so too, Florence agreed. I will always love him, you know. He was my first love, the father of my first 3 children. I know, Robert said without any hint of jealousy. And I love you enough to accept that part of your heart will always belong to him. There is room for both of us in your heart, just like there is room for all our children. Florence turned to kiss her husband, still marveling after all these years that she had found this kind of love twice in one lifetime. Some people never found it once. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There were hard times, of course. A drought one year that killed some of the cattle. A winter so harsh they were snowed in for 6 weeks. Minor illnesses and injuries, the normal trials of life and ranching. But through it all, Florence and Robert faced everything together. They were partners in every sense of the word, making decisions together, supporting each other, loving each other through good times and bad. Thomas Jr. married a rancher's daughter from the next valley and built a house on the Fuller land. He and his wife had 4 children, and the ranch expanded to accommodate the growing family. Bobby, when he came of age, decided he wanted to be a horse breeder, and Robert helped him establish his own operation on a portion of the Fuller land. Rose, independent and stubborn like her mother, announced at 16 that she wanted to be a teacher. Robert and Florence sent her to a teacher's college in Salt Lake City, and she returned to teach at the school in Parowan. She eventually married a lawyer and settled in town, but she came home often. Margaret and Sarah also had families of their own, and the ranch became the gathering place for all of them. Sunday dinners were huge affairs with children running everywhere and multiple generations gathered around the table. Florence cooked enormous meals and loved every minute of the chaos. Robert built additions onto the house over the years, more bedrooms for when the grandchildren visited, a larger dining room to accommodate everyone. The ranch that had once seemed too big for one man was now bursting at the seams with family. One Sunday afternoon, when Florence was 58 years old, she stood in her kitchen preparing dinner for 23 people. 3 of her children were there with their spouses and children, and Miguel and Carlos, now elderly but still living in the bunkhouse, would join them as they always did. Robert came into the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her from behind, just as he had done thousands of times over the years. "You should let the girls help you more," he murmured against her hair. "I like doing it," Florence said, leaning back against him. "I like feeding my family. It makes me happy." "You make me happy," Robert said. "Every single day." Florence turned in his arms and looked up at him. His hair was completely white now, his face deeply lined from years in the sun. But he was still handsome to her, still the man who had loaded her belongings into his wagon and said, "Follow me home." "I love you, Robert Fuller," she said, as she had said countless times over the past 33 years. "I love you too, Florence Fuller," he replied, as he had replied countless times, "until my last breath and beyond." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, while the house filled with the sound of their family. Children's laughter drifted in from outside. Adult voices murmured in the sitting room. Life and love and family surrounded them. Florence thought about the woman she had been that day in Parowan, desperate and frightened and at the end of her rope. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything. And she thought about how one man's kindness, one decision to help a stranger had changed the course of her entire life. "Thank you," she whispered against Robert's chest. "For what, darling? For everything. For saving us. For loving us. For giving me a life more beautiful than I ever imagined possible." Robert kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for accepting my help that day. Thank you for taking a chance on me. Thank you for loving me back. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Florence. You and all our children and this life we have built together." Dinner that evening was as chaotic and wonderful as always. The table was crowded, food was passed around amid laughter and conversation, and Florence looked at each face around the table, her heart so full of love she thought it might burst. After dinner, the family gathered outside to enjoy the warm evening. The grandchildren played while the adults sat and talked. Florence sat beside Robert, his hand holding hers, and watched the sun set over the valley she had come to love so much. "Grandmother, tell us the story again," one of Margaret's daughters begged, climbing into Florence's lap even though she was getting too big for it. "What story, sweetheart?" "The story of how you and grandfather met, how he saved you." Florence looked at Robert and they shared a smile. "Well," Florence began, "it was a hot August day in 1878, and I was standing in the street with all my belongings scattered around me. I had just lost my home, and I did not know what I was going to do or where my children were going to sleep that night." The other grandchildren gathered around now, even though they had heard this story many times. They never tired of it. "And then your grandfather drove up in his wagon. He did not know me, had never seen me before in his life, but he looked at me and my children and he said, 'I've got a wagon right here. We can load everything up, just like that, without a moment's hesitation.' And then what happened?" the children chorused, even though they knew. "Then he helped us load everything into his wagon. And when we were done, he said, 'Follow me home,' so we did. And that home has been our home ever since." "It is the best story," Margaret's daughter sighed contentedly. "It is a true story," Robert said, reaching over to ruffle the girl's hair. "And the best part is that it turned out even better than a story. Because we have all of you now, our children and grandchildren. We have this beautiful life. All because I was in the right place at the right time to help someone who needed it. And because grandmother was brave enough to accept help," Thomas Jr. added. He had been a baby that day and did not remember it, but he had heard the story so many times it felt like a memory. "She has always been brave," Robert said, looking at his wife with such love that Florence felt tears prick her eyes. "The bravest person I have ever known." The evening stretched on, warm and perfect, and eventually the families headed to their homes or to the guest rooms in the house. Florence and Robert were left alone as they so often were on their porch swing. "You think we will have many more years like this?" Florence asked softly. They were both getting older, feeling the aches and pains that came with age. "I hope so," Robert said. "But however many years we have left, I will be grateful for every single one. As long as I am with you, that is all I need." Florence squeezed his hand. "Me too." They had 8 more good years together. 8 more years of Sunday dinners and grandchildren and quiet evenings on the porch swing. 8 more years of love and laughter and the life they had built together. Robert passed away in his sleep one cold February night, just 2 months shy of his 72nd birthday. Florence woke up beside him and knew immediately that he was gone. She held his hand and cried, grieving the loss of the man who had been her partner, her love, her everything for 41 years. But even in her grief, Florence knew how lucky she had been. She had been loved deeply, twice in one lifetime. She had raised 5 children and seen them grow into good, strong adults. She had built a home and a family and a legacy that would continue long after she was gone. At Robert's funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives he had touched. Miguel, now in his 80s, spoke about Robert's kindness and fairness as an employer. Eleanor Foster, a widow herself now, spoke about his generosity to the community. Each of Florence's children spoke about what Robert had meant to them, how he had been a true father in every sense of the word. Florence sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and listened to them speak about the man she had loved. And she knew that Robert's legacy was not just the ranch he had built, but the family he had created, the lives he had touched, the love he had given so freely. After the funeral, Florence stayed on at the ranch. Thomas Jr. and his family lived in the house with her, running the ranch now, but it was still Florence's home. She spent her days cooking for the family, tending her garden, playing with her great-grandchildren who were beginning to arrive. In the evenings, she would sit on the porch swing, the one Robert had built for her so many years ago, and think about her life. About Thomas, her first husband, taken too soon. About Robert, who had given her a second chance at happiness. About her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, this huge, loving family that had sprung from such painful beginnings. She lived for 6 more years after Robert died, and they were good years, if lonely ones. She was surrounded by family, loved and cared for, and she knew how blessed she was. On a warm spring morning just after her 71st birthday, Florence passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her children found her in her bed, looking peaceful, a slight smile on her face. On the nightstand beside her was a photograph of Robert, and tucked under her pillow was one of the notes he had written her so many years ago, creased and faded but still legible. "Thinking of you." They buried Florence beside Robert on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a large oak tree that Robert had planted the year they married. The entire family gathered, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, plus friends from all over the territory who had known and loved Florence. Margaret, now in her 60s herself, spoke at her mother's funeral. "My mother taught me what strength looks like," she said, her voice thick with tears. "She taught me that love is always worth the risk. She taught me that family is not just blood, but the people who choose to love you and stand by you. She lost everything once and she rebuilt. She loved deeply, twice, and she never let fear stop her from living fully. That is the legacy she leaves us." Thomas Jr., the baby who did not remember that desperate day in Parowan, also spoke. "Robert Fuller was not my blood father, but he was my father in every way that mattered. He chose to love me and raise me as his own, and I will be forever grateful. But none of that would have happened if my mother had not been brave enough to accept help when she needed it, to trust a stranger, to take a chance on a new life. She saved us that day as much as Robert did. She saved us by being willing to try again, to love again, to hope again." The family gathered at the ranch after the funeral, just as they had gathered so many times when Florence was alive. They ate and shared memories and told stories. The great-grandchildren ran through the house and yard, their laughter echoing the laughter of their parents and grandparents before them. And on the hill, under the oak tree, Florence and Robert rested together, their love story complete. It had started with an act of kindness on a hot August day in Parowan, Utah Territory. It had been tested by time and circumstance, by grief and hardship. but it had endured, strong and true, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and love. Their family continued to thrive on the ranch for generations to come. The story of how Robert saved Florence and her children, how he loaded their belongings and said, "Follow me home," became a family legend, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren. It became a reminder that even in the darkest moments, kindness can change everything. That one person's decision to help can ripple outward, creating love and family and hope for generations. The Fuller Ranch remained in the family for over 100 years, each generation adding to it, improving it, but always honoring the foundation that Robert and Florence had built together. The house was expanded and modernized, but the original structure remained, including the porch with its swing, where countless family members sat over the decades, watching the sun set over the valley, feeling connected to the love story that had started it all. Margaret's great-great-granddaughter eventually wrote a book about Florence and Robert's story, based on letters and journals that had been preserved by the family. It became a bestseller, touching hearts around the country, reminding people that love could be found even in the most desperate circumstances, that second chances were real, that kindness mattered. But the real legacy of Florence and Robert was not in the ranch or the book or even the large family they created. It was in the values they passed down, the lessons they taught just by living their lives. Work hard, love fiercely, help others when you can, do not be afraid to start over. Accept kindness when it is offered. Take chances on people and on love. On the ranch, in a place of honor in the main house, hung a photograph taken on Florence and Robert's 30th wedding anniversary. In it, they stood together on the porch, Robert's arm around Florence's waist, both of them smiling at the camera. They were not young in the photograph, their faces marked by time and sun and hard work. But the love between them was obvious, radiating from the image like warmth from a fire. Beneath the photograph was a small plaque with an inscription chosen by their children, Florence and Robert Fuller. She needed help. He offered it. Together, they built a legacy of love. And that, in the end, was the truest thing. A widow was evicted with her children on a hot day in August 1878. A cowboy loaded their belongings into his wagon and said, "Follow me home." And from that single act of kindness, from that one decision to help a stranger in need, grew a love that lasted a lifetime and a family that would endure for generations. It was a simple story in many ways, the kind that happened in the Wild West more often than history books recorded. People helped each other, took chances on strangers, built lives out of nothing but determination and hope. But it was also an extraordinary story, proof that the best things in life often came from the worst moments, that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. That home was not a place, but the people you chose to share your life with. Florence and Robert's story was one of love and loss and second chances. It was about courage and kindness, and the power of choosing to hope even when everything seemed hopeless. It was about family, not just blood family but chosen family, the family you create through love and commitment and showing up every single day. And it was a story with a happy ending, the kind of ending that Florence had not dared to dream of when she stood in the street in Parowan with her 3 frightened children and her meager belongings scattered around her. She had thought her story was over that day, that she had nothing left to lose and nothing to hope for. But Robert had seen something different when he looked at her. He had seen a woman worth helping, a family worth saving, a future worth building. And because he acted on that vision, because Florence was brave enough to accept his help, they created something beautiful together. Their love story became the foundation upon which generations of family was built. Every child born into that family, every marriage, every new beginning, was part of the legacy that Florence and Robert created on that August day in 1878. Years after both were gone, when their great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren gathered at the ranch for reunions, they would walk up the hill to visit the graves under the oak tree. They would stand there, feeling connected to these two people they had never met but who had shaped their entire existence, and they would remember the story. The widow was evicted with her children. The cowboy loaded their belongings and said, "Follow me home." And from that moment, from that simple act of kindness and courage, came all of this, all of them, this entire legacy of love that continued to grow and flourish, generation after generation. It was proof that love was the most powerful force in the world, stronger than hardship, stronger than loss, stronger than time itself. Florence and Robert had loved each other deeply, truly, completely, and that love had not died with them. It lived on in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch they had built together, in the story that would be told and retold for as long as anyone remembered. They had built something that lasted, something that mattered, something beautiful. And it all started with a man who saw someone in need and decided to help, and a woman who was brave enough to accept that help and take a chance on a new future. Their story was complete now, a closed circle, a finished tale. But the love they created continued, rippling outward into the future, touching lives they would never meet, creating joy they would never see. And that, perhaps, was the most beautiful ending of all.